Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is well and that you've had a scintillating week wherever you are. Before I begin, I'd like to give my usual thanks to the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the art that he has produced for this series, and to my Patreons. Every time you give me a financial pledge, it is much appreciated. I'm also going to mention the Hunger Games Discord, where interactive tales are created based on your choices. Feel free to find the link for that in the description, along with all the other links that are related to this series. Two little things of note. I usually have a break after a quinquennial quell. However, I'm actually going to have a break next week before the 100th Games. It just works out a little bit easier that way. Also, I'm going to do a Q&A at the end of that video. So if you would like to ask me a question that I will try and feature in there, feel free to leave it in the attached comment for this video. So I think that's everything sorted. Without further ado, let's go. The 99th Games took place in the year 111, 35 years after the Second Rebellion. Following a rather chaotic reaping in District 3 due to an unfortunate technical malfunction that caused problems with the transmission to the capital, Castro Astriana, victor of the 98th Hunger Games, arrived in District 2. Unlike past victors from outlying districts, Castro appeared excited to watch the traditional reaping games, which saw volunteers rip bracelets from each other's wrists and necks, until the one remaining male and one remaining female volunteers would earn the title of tributes for the district. The reaping arena that was used for the reaping games had become worn over the years, and now resembled more of a muddy swamp than the field that it once was. Furthermore, most of the large rocks in this arena had been damaged and eroded, which left many smaller rocks by their sides. 18-year-old Lazarus Dalton, nephew of Ennius Dalton, victor of the 76th Hunger Games, dispatched of 3 fellow volunteers within the first 10 minutes of the games, by holding each of them down and ripping off their bracelets with ease, before using the jagged edge of a small rock to slice the letter L into their cheeks, which caused them to bleed from these wounds when they were airlifted to safety, as Lazarus laughed and swiftly moved on to his next target. Towards the end of these games, he discovered his 2 remaining opponents, Attalus Plim and Marcus Perez, hiding together behind a large rock, with several smaller rocks at their disposal. Although it was considered an unwritten rule that the rocks could not be used as weapons, an exception appeared to be made for this final fight. Attalus and Marcus threw rocks at Lazarus as he sprinted towards them, but he used his lightning reactions to avoid most of these rocks, whilst even managing to catch some, which he threw directly back towards Attalus and Marcus, which seemed to cause them a lot of pain. Once Lazarus reached the pair, he knocked their heads together, before removing both of their wrist bracelets and carving an L in various places on their unconscious bodies. It was only when Attalus and Marcus began to stir that Lazarus finally ripped off their neck bracelets, and as they were airlifted to safety while shuddering in pain, Lazarus made no effort to hide his smile, until he was announced to be District 2's male tribute for the 99th Hunger Games. During this announcement, he triumphantly roared with pride, claiming that this was always going to be. Eugenia Ravenstill joked to Ennius that he was definitely a Dalton, to which Ennius proudly nodded. Meanwhile, 18-year-old Selena Brax had only lost 1 bracelet in the initial scuffle, before roaming through the arena and ruthlessly knocking any other opponent that she had encountered unconscious, then ripping off their bracelets. Towards the end of the games, Selena chased and eliminated her friend, Ariana Galloway, although she did not knock her out, later explaining that she offered her this courtesy as they were friends. As Ariana was airlifted above Selena, she wished her luck, before looking out and shouting that the other 2 are fighting over there, whilst pointing at Selena's remaining opponents, Kuka Lemmings and Livia Montsec, who were indeed fighting in the direction that Ariana was pointing. As Selena carefully approached this area, she spotted Lazarus over a small hill, throwing rocks at his opponents, and she appeared confused, possibly by the fact that this was being allowed. Yet she grinned and grabbed some rocks from the ground before continuing to Livia and Kuka. When these girls each had only 1 bracelet remaining, Selena suddenly appeared behind the nearest hill and threw these rocks simultaneously with both hands. Although she stood almost 15 meters away, 1 rock hit Livia's head, whilst the other hit Kuka's, with Selena's ambidextrous accuracy impressing many viewers. As both girls lay unconscious or barely moving, Selena approached them, and whilst laughing at their dazed expressions and murmurs, she ripped off their bracelets in unison, and was subsequently announced to be District 2's female tribute for the 99th Hunger Games. After Lazarus and Selena had been flown back to the centre of District 2, they were promptly bathed, groomed, and dressed in extravagant clothes for the title ceremony, in which they were officially named as the district's tributes for this year. Lazarus wore a dark suit that was almost an exact match for his skin tone, although it was embroidered in pure gold, which gave a slight impression that parts of his body were golden. As for Selena, she wore a white dress of a thin upper half, but a short flowing lower half, with an identical golden embroidery to that of Lazarus. Eugenia in particular seemed to like these outfits, stating that Lazarus resembled an expensive warrior, while Selena was an epitome of the elegance of yesteryear. The pair briefly met their families and friends in the town hall, but unlike most other districts, these meetings were more joyous occasions in District 2, and this year was no exception. Both Lazarus and Selena appeared convinced that when they next saw their visitors, they would have just achieved victory in the games and fame throughout Panem. As the peacekeepers came to escort them to the station, Lazarus's mother jokingly reminded him to not outperform Uncle Ennius and Cousin Rubius too harshly, while Selena joked to her family that she would bring them each a nice souvenir back from the capital. As the sun set, they were swiftly escorted onto the train, and before they even reached the dining carriage towards the front, the short journey to the capital had begun. Their mentor, Rubius Dalton, victor of the 86th Hunger Games, entered just a minute after them, and he joyfully shook his cousin, Lazarus's hand, whilst patting him on the back and congratulating him, before shaking and kissing Selena's hand. With not a lot of time remaining before they would reach the capital, Rubius swiftly asked Selena and Lazarus to sit down with him at the dining table, and he ordered the Avox present to bring in a large tray of meat. Rubius then turned on the screen and started his analysis of their opponents, with the tributes who had been reaped 2 days prior in District 14. But before he could even finish his analysis of Skye from 14, Selena asked where her mentor was. A tense moment settled over the carriage, as Rubius recounted how Alicia Heath, victor at the 89th Hunger Games, had died the previous year. He was about to continue, but Selena replied that she knew, before asking why there was not anyone else for the job. Rubius was clearly exasperated by the second interruption, but he responded that he had told the capital he would mentor both tributes. Selena seemed slightly perplexed by this admission, but as Rubius carried on, she listened quickly. Rubius encouraged both Lazarus and Selena to eat as they watched the other tributes' reapings and analysed their threat levels, with Lazarus laughing at Litz and Radia, both from 3, while saying to Selena that they were his for the kill, to which she simply nodded and smiled, although when they reanalysed District 6 reaping, she added that Boston and Phoenix, both from 6, were hers. With 10 minutes to go before they arrived in the capital, Selena went to the toilet, whilst Rubius spoke to Lazarus about what he had seen of Selena so far. He advised Lazarus to make a distanced friendship with her and to clip her if she killed too many tributes. Lazarus nodded and said that he had thought as much, but when Selena re-entered the main carriage, she appeared unsettled to see Lazarus and Rubius quickly ending this conversation. Selena asked them what they were discussing, but when Rubius simply told her not to worry, she rather aggressively replied that she expected him to help her as much as he was helping Lazarus. Yet Rubius quickly marched across the carriage towards Selena, which made her step back slightly in response. Rubius raised a hand into the air, and Selena automatically attempted to cover herself, but instead of hitting her, he simply took one of the tied-up curls of her red hair, before loosening it, and telling her to wear her hair long. As Rubius walked away, Selena seemed slightly relieved, but after he said that she should try to make herself likeable before arriving in the capital, she glared at Rubius's back, whilst Lazarus tried to contain his laughter. A few minutes later, the train arrived in Snow Station, with a large crowd of capital citizens desperately trying to catch even a glimpse of 2 of the famous Dalton family in the same place. Rubius and Lazarus left the train together to many cheers and shouts from the crowd, and they posed for pictures with the citizens who asked for them. However, before Rubius had called for Selena to exit the train, she was making her way down the steps to the platform. Many of those present were suddenly distracted as Selena came into view, and she was even aided down from the final step by a pair of young men whom she warmly thanked. Selena's bright smile and extroverted personality soon diverted more attention away from Rubius and Lazarus, with one old lady, who must have seen the reaping games, even asking if Selena could aim for a target from 20 meters away. She responded that she could do this if she had a weapon, and this lady produced an apple from her handbag, which she asked Selena to throw back into her bag from this distance down the platform. Rubius curiously watched her, as Lazarus continued to sign autographs and pose with his admirers, one of whom said that she would never leave if he married her. Selina walked approximately 20 meters down the platform from the lady, whose handbag was now open. She then placed her hand over her eyes, which surprised the crowd even more, before throwing the apple, which landed directly into the bag, at which point she curtsied and smiled, amidst the sound of excited cheers and applause. Rubeus then called Selina back, announcing that he and his tributes looked forward to seeing everyone at the parade the next evening. A dismayed groan was heard from the crowd as the trio left, and they were swiftly taken to their limousine that awaited them outside the station. According to the Avox driver, Zorillo, who was one of those that escaped after these games, Rubeus congratulated both his tributes for the impressions that they had just made, but he also warned Selina to not show off this early, especially after last year's debacle. Shortly after the trio arrived in their apartment at the accommodation tower, they met their stylist, Ariadne Fling, who enthusiastically greeted them with the word enchanté. Although Rubeus frowned at this greeting and said that it was inappropriate, whilst Lazarus and Selina appeared unaware of what was happening. Ariadne's team of stylists entered the apartment shortly after, and they took the relevant measurements for Lazarus and Selina. As Ariadne was examining Selina in closer detail, she asked Rubeus where Selina's mentor was, but he once again explained that he was the mentor to both tributes, to which Ariadne frowned and turned back to Selina. In fact, whilst Rubeus continued to speak to Lazarus about the other tributes, Ariadne quietly whispered to Selina that she appeared to have picked the short straw. Selina nonchalantly stated that she could win without a mentor, to which Ariadne smiled and replied, "That's the spirit." Lazarus asked Rubeus some more about the upcoming parade and training, loudly mentioning that he wanted to be dressed as a golden warrior, although Ariadne appeared to be too busy taking Selina's extra measurements to hear this suggestion. The men then practiced empty-handed fighting, during which they each managed to achieve some decent hits, but towards the end of the fight, Rubeus grabbed a knife from the table, before humorously holding it to Lazarus's throat from behind as they looked in the mirror, whilst joking that Rubeus should always check for weapons. At that moment, the screen showed Treasure and Pearl, both from one, being officially announced as the tributes for their district, and Ariadne made sure that Rubeus was distracted, before whispering to Selina, "Alguien me dijo que la chica tengo una fobia de insectos." Selina frowned, and Ariadne repeated the sentence, whilst nodding as Pearl's statistics appeared on the screen. Selina asked if this was a phobia of insects, to which Ariadne nodded, but just as Selina looked ready to ask more questions, Ariadne stood up, clapped her hands, and said that she had decided what they would wear. The pair were subsequently fitted for plain, white peacekeeper outfits, but just as Lazarus seemed to be about to protest this choice, Ariadne also mentioned that these garments would tear away, to show something else. Lazarus impatiently asked what this would be, but Ariadne told him that he would find out tomorrow. Lazarus subsequently asked if he could work in the training center, and Rubeus responded that they could not until the day after the next. This greatly annoyed Lazarus, who moaned that he wanted to start using the weapons, but Rubeus told him that they could continue to spar in this room, whilst re-watching the reapings of the other districts, which they proceeded to do. Meanwhile, Ariadne asked Selina if she wanted to head to the balcony with her. It is not known exactly what the ladies discussed, but according to the Avox present in the apartment, Selina seemed extremely annoyed about Rubeus's attitude towards her. However, Ariadne listened to Selina's ranting, and she offered her some advice, which appeared to make her feel better. In fact, as the ladies re-entered from the balcony, Selina was heard to thank Ariadne for listening. Prior to leaving their apartment the next evening, Ariadne ordered her team to paint Lazarus and Selina's bodies, including their faces, in sparkling golden paint, and for the pair to wear golden underclothes to cover their areas of modesty. Although Selina was clearly apprehensive about this idea, Ariadne assured her that it would make a statement, and Lazarus appeared elated. The group then headed to the Avenue of the Tributes, where they waited in the queue of chariots behind Pearl and Treasure, both from one, who were being advised on how to act in the parade by their respective mentors, Mirai Kobayashi and Dollar Crusoe, victors of the 94th and 95th Hunger Games. Lazarus and Selina politely introduced themselves, and the quartet discussed their fellow tributes as they looked down the line of chariots. Treasure mentioned that they needed to watch the outliers very carefully during training, to which Pearl added that Watusi from 10 was up to something already. The tributes were then called to mount their chariots, which they proceeded to do. Lazarus and Selina stubbornly placed the helmets over their heads, so that their faces could not be seen from the outside. However, as the chariots were about to leave, Ariadne told them to remove their helmets and throw them off during the third note of the crescendo in Horn of Plenty. Treasure and Pearl were applauded as their chariot entered the avenue, with Eugenia saying that their ruby-studded outfits were nice but unlikely to be memorable in a few days' time. As instructed by Ariadne, Lazarus and Selina stood still on the platform and looked straight ahead, whilst their peacekeeper attire received a much more extreme reaction, with Ennius proudly applauding, whilst Eugenia said they did not just do that. Yet she then added that it would be nice to see who's under there, with many audience members appearing to echo the sentiment. Boston and Phoenix, both from 6, wore jet wings over their shoulders. Although these outfits were met with cheers, they became even louder when the wings produced flames, as if to mimic the exhaust from real engines, which even made Garrick and Esther, both from 7, cower from the chariot behind, whilst Ennius laughed and joked that the leaves all over this pair's brown clothing were going to ignite. However, the attention was diverted from Boston and Phoenix when Lazarus and Selina simultaneously removed their helmets during the crescendo at the anthem, which triggered the rest of their peacekeeper uniforms to suddenly shrivel up and blow off to the side of the avenue. The audience cheered as the pair's bodies glistened under the golden paint that covered them, and instead of standing still like they had been, they now waved enthusiastically. Later that evening, Rubius allegedly became extremely angry that Boston and Phoenix had won the title of Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed, before smashing a glass of whiskey to the floor and asking where that Asher cow was when she was needed. However, Selina responded that she wanted to kill them even more now, and Rubius laughed once more when he saw Jackson and Cleanser, both from 12, who were dressed as syringes, which had not been well received by the capital. Lazarus and Selina were both clearly excited to begin training the next day. Training Master Ennius Dalton warned all tributes of the rules for the training. At one point, Cleanser from 12 was seen whispering to Watusi from 10, which clearly annoyed Ennius. However, as he was unable to slap Cleanser, who was stood at the back of the group of tributes, he chose to slap Jackson from 12, who was stood within arm's reach. Lazarus and Selina soon engaged with Treasure and Pearl. Selina asked them if they were equally annoyed about the choice of Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed, to which Treasure nodded. Yet whilst they looked over to see Boston and Phoenix looking docile in the camouflage station, Pearl replied that they did not have much to worry about in the arena. Over this first day of training, Lazarus worked in the different weaponry stations with Treasure, and whilst Lazarus was more gifted with his reaction times and use of short-distance weapons, Treasure was more talented with his own strength and projectile weapons, which finally balanced their skill sets and allowed them to work well with each other. Meanwhile, Selina and Pearl circulated around various stations, often appearing to watch the other tributes, many of whom seemed too scared to challenge them. They even sat by Watusi for an entire hour while she practiced in the survival station and then the planting station, which clearly bothered her, especially when she accidentally placed soil in her hair, which made Selina laugh. Later in the afternoon, Selina made Pearl laugh by pushing Marinella from a 4 from behind into the main pool of the aquatic station. As they walked away, they both had to stifle their laughter when they heard Ennius shouting at Marinella to be more careful. Over the second day, all 4 career tributes continued to practice in whichever training stations were closest to certain tributes, but most notably those of outlying districts, which appeared to stop them from even attempting to communicate with each other. At one point, Treasure even approached Jackson from 12 and Sky from 14, who were talking together, before ordering them to stop this conversation, which resulted in the pair scurrying away to different stations. Around midday, Ennius spoke to Lazarus and gave him some advice in the sword-fighting station. Lazarus asked if he could fight Puff from 8, and Ennius happily agreed, before forcing Puff, who was loudly protesting, into the sparring ring with Lazarus. Within the minute, Puff was begging for mercy whilst bleeding from his mouth and nose, but Ennius ordered the fight to continue. However, Litz, from 3, had been watching this fight whilst he was building a large circuit in the adjacent electrical station with radio from 3. After another minute had passed, he approached Ennius and asked if this was fair, but Ennius simply slapped him and asked if he wanted to be next, which saw him swiftly return to his station whilst Lazarus laughed. Once Puff was unconscious, Ennius gave Lazarus some advice on how he could have finished it quicker, before suggesting that he work in the spear station. Meanwhile, Selina had been practicing alone in the archery station for most of the day, until she was joined by Garrett from 7 in the early afternoon. She initially ignored him, but as she noticed him looking at her, he asked if she did it both ways. Selina appeared shocked and continued to look away from Garrett, but demanded to know how he had heard this. Yet before Garrett could even respond, Selina replied that firstly, this was none of his business, secondly, it was healthy to experiment, and last of all, she had not drunk whiskey since. However, Garrick grinned and responded that he was talking about the way Selena could fire arrows with both hands. She appeared flustered, but swiftly turned back to fire an arrow, before replying that this was indeed true. Garrick nodded, but as Selena was about to let the arrow fly, he replied that the other bit was good to know, which made her gasp, and the arrow flew off target. Selena appeared annoyed with Garrick, and asked him to stop distracting her, to which he grinned and replied that she had been distracting him since he first saw her at the parade, and that he would never look at the colour gold in the same way. Selena sighed impatiently, before pointing the arrow towards Garrick, and looking at him properly for the first time. She suddenly appeared quite mesmerised by his wavy brown hair and muscular physique, but he put his hands in the air and smiled as the training staff rushed over. As Selena pensively looked at Garrick, with the arrow still pointed towards him, he apologised, before stating that he simply thought she was the prettiest girl in here by a mile, whilst pointing around the room. The training staff arrived and asked what was happening, but Selena appeared to have forgotten that she was holding the arrow at the ready, and as they began to remove Garrick from the station, Selena said that there was no problem, and that she would practice somewhere else, yet it was noticed that she appeared rather distracted for the rest of the day. The next morning, Lazarus and Selena were two of the first tributes to display their talents for game maker Anastasia Breen and the other assessors. For his display, Lazarus showed many equally creative ways to destroy a training dummy, while Selena showed some of the most accurate projectiles ever seen from the most challenging distances. It was Pearl, Lazarus, and Sky from 14 who tied at the top of this year's lineup with a score of 10, while Selena, who was allegedly furious to have been beaten by Pearl, scored a 9. Yet as they saw these scores, Ariadne reminded her not to worry and that she was very close to the top indeed. Meanwhile, Puff and Whipper, both from 8, landed at the bottom of the pack with scores of 3, after what Breen described as a pitiful display of weakness and a pathetic show of knitting. The next evening was the last before the games, and it was then that the interviews took place. Pearl and Treasure each performed well, with the latter stating that he would try to kill each of the other tributes through equally interesting yet diverse methods. Selena dressed in a white and golden striped gown that appeared to be a repurposed version of what she had worn for the title ceremony. She confidently answered the usual opening questions and had a comical back and forth with Eugenia, which clearly made a strong impression on the audience. Yet Selena appeared fazed when Eugenia asked if there were any tributes that had greatly impressed her, while suggestively winking as she said these last few words. Selena blushed slightly as she collected her thoughts. However, before she could give an answer, Eugenia squealed with excitement and asked if it was Lazarus that had impressed her. Selena quickly responded in the affirmative, stating that she had always admired his sparring techniques from their work in the Dalton Elite, but that he had impressed her even more since they arrived in the capital. Eugenia nodded and said that this was understandable, before asking if she felt threatened by Lazarus's reputation as a member of the Dalton dynasty. This once again appeared to throw Selena, but she soon composed herself and replied that this was a new year and a new games, and that she looked forward to building her own legacy once she won, which triggered respectful applause and cheers as Eugenia ended the interview. As for Lazarus, he dressed in a stunning golden robe, which mustered many loud cheers and shouts from the audience as he entered the stage, with some even making an L shape with their hands in honour of Lazarus's reaping games. After some flirtatious banter with Eugenia, who jokingly fanned herself, he said that he looked forward to bringing victory back to where it belonged. Eugenia also asked Lazarus what he thought of Selena's opinion of him, to which he replied that he had not been listening to her interview, which provoked laughter from the audience. It is unknown if Lazarus was being serious or not, but Eugenia repeated what Selena had said, to which Lazarus nodded and said that he was pleased with her respect. However, towards the end of this interview, Eugenia asked on a rather serious note if it ever became easier to see his siblings and cousins dying in the games, of which 5 had died in the last 10 years alone. Lazarus appeared slightly perplexed by this question, replying that it was never hard in the first place, as the Hunger Games were the reason for his family's fame. A respectful applause followed this answer, and as Eugenia dismissed Lazarus, the applause was joined by cheers. During the remaining interviews, the only main events worth noting were the constant sobbing of Marinella from 4, who claimed to have hurt her wrist during training, Garrick from 7, who said that he was most surprised by a girl he had met, to which Eugenia jokingly replied that she was flattered but already taken, whilst Watusi from 10 was careful to dodge Eugenia's questions regarding a repeat of last year's ideas. As for Game Maker Breen, she was met with a standing ovation from the crowd, most likely due to the successful games that she had produced over the last 2 years. As usual, Eugenia tried to extract some information from Breen regarding the upcoming games, but she simply replied that although the arena would be more traditional, the games would by no means be boring, which mustered some curious sounds from the audience. When the group from District 2 returned to their apartment, Rubius and Lazarus immediately turned on the screen, before analysing each tribute's responses, body language, and reactions over the evening. Rubius praised Lazarus for his ability to understand what the other tributes were thinking, and he reminded Lazarus that this would serve him well within the arena. As for Selena, the AVOX present in the apartment reported that she spent most of the next hour pacing up and down the balcony, whilst appearing to rant to Ariadne, although it was unknown what had made her so angry. However, as Selena eventually broke down in tears, which was rare for a career tribute, Ariadne comforted her, and she appeared to listen in bewilderment as Ariadne leaned in closely to speak to her for the next 5 minutes. The next day, the tributes were flown to the arena and dressed in jackets of their district colours, along with dark navy trousers and black boots. Rubius said that he looked forward to seeing Lazarus on the other side, before reminding him to not overthink, and to simply enjoy the experience. Lazarus embraced his cousin and entered the tube, where he excitedly paced on the spot as he waited for the games to begin. Selena was visited by Ariadne, who helped her into her clothes and stated, "We're all supporting you," which made Selena nod and grin. As she entered her tube, Ariadne wished her buena suerte, to which Selena replied, "Gracias." Seconds later, the tubes rose into the arena. This year's games took place in an arena known as the Stream Forest. This arena was relatively large compared to others of previous years. Dense forests of tall, thin trees covered most of the arena, along with streams of fresh water that were bedded with rocks. The inner half of this arena was almost completely flat, although as one travelled further from the centre, one would encounter a gradual rise in the ground's altitude until one reached the perimeter to find steep hills full of sparsely planted trees, along with large lakes that fed the streams that flowed all the way to the central clearing. The cornucopia lay in the middle of this grassy clearing, with its mouth facing south, towards the 26 podiums that were more closely positioned to each other than usual. Compared to previous years, a much larger quantity of supplies lay between the podiums and the cornucopia, although just like previous years, the more useful supplies, such as ropes, sleeping bags, and even night vision goggles, were placed closest to the cornucopia. Furthermore, in a similar manner to the beginnings of the other games crafted by game maker Breen, various weapons such as bows and arrows and small sets of throwing knives had been inconspicuously placed within these supplies, along with a much greater variety of weapons in the cornucopia itself. As the podiums entered the arena, Eugenia noted that several tributes seemed relieved to be stood in a normal setting, as they looked around to see forests and a bright blue sky, along with a moderate temperature. Whilst most tributes looked at their surroundings and the supplies that lay ahead of them, the career tributes were already making eye contact with each other, and Ennius tried to decipher their upcoming plans based on their body and hand signals. Lazarus, from 2, was stood halfway along the left side of podiums, between Cleanser from 12 and Litz from 3, the former of whom was trying to eye Lazarus out of the corner of her eye without him noticing. As for Selena, from 2, she was stood on a central right podium between Boston from 6 and Whipper from 8, the latter of whom appeared to be trying to gather the attention of Puff from 8, who was stood just a few podiums along. Lazarus and Selena made eye contact with Treasure and Pearl, both from 1, who were each stood more towards the edges of the line of podiums. When the countdown was halfway to completion, Lazarus quickly eyed Selena, and they nodded to each other. As the countdown went through its final few seconds, Lazarus readjusted his eyesight to the cornucopia that lay ahead, while Selena appeared to be focusing on a target that was a little closer. The gong sounded and Selena sprinted straight forwards. Whipper was actually seen trying to grab onto Selena's golden jacket, but Selena ran ahead with much more speed and therefore did not even appear to notice Whipper's failed attempt to grab her. Selena continued running ahead, and she grabbed a bow and its arrows that had been nestled between a pair of sleeping bags. She readied the first arrow whilst the boy from 14 ran across and looked ready to tackle her, but she quickly shot him through the neck, which saw him fall at her feet. Selena glanced with some revulsion towards the body at her feet, but as she looked back towards the cornucopia, she seemed pleased that most tributes were now fighting together for supplies ahead of her. Selena then readied another arrow, as she saw Lazarus and Treasure beginning to defend the cornucopia from other incoming tributes. When the gong sounded, Lazarus also ran straight ahead. He appeared to have predicted what Cleanser from 12 was about to do, and as she ran in to tackle him, he quickly punched his left hand up into her face, which saw her fall backwards, and as she got up, her nose was already bleeding. However, Lazarus did not let this slow him down, and he continued sprinting towards the mouth of the cornucopia. Antonio from 10 appeared to have reached a sword at the entrance just a second before, but as he brandished it in Lazarus's direction, Lazarus narrowly avoided its swipe, before punching Antonio across the face with enough force to push him against the wall behind him. Lazarus then grabbed another sword and slashed Antonio in the neck, whilst the boy from 5 was about to run inwards. When he saw Lazarus holding this sword, he suddenly held back, but he was subsequently pounced upon by Pearl, who now had a set of throwing knives in her hand. Lazarus briefly looked ahead to see Selina, who had remained in the spot where she had taken the bow and arrow, and she proceeded to shoot the girl from 5, who was trying to run away with a loaf of bread. Selina then noticed a mass of fruit to her right, which Skye from 14 and Jackson from 12 seemed ready to approach, and so she slowly walked towards it with her bow and arrows at the ready. However, as this pair saw Selina approaching, they backed away, and although Selina looked ready to shoot them, she appeared to realise that she only had one arrow left, but she was then distracted by what was happening in the mouth of the cornucopia. During this time, Lazarus had stabbed the girl from 9 when she tried to run past him, but just as Lazarus looked back around for his next target, he spotted Puff from 8 and both tributes from 11, who were running towards the other side of the cornucopia's mouth, where Treasure was only armed with a spear. Treasure managed to stab the girl from 11 with the spear, but he was subsequently tackled to the ground by Puff and the boy from 11, the latter of whom held Treasure down whilst the former stabbed him with a knife. During this time, Treasure's district partner Pearl had been occupied by chasing Esther from 7 through the south of the clearing, and she therefore failed to notice him being attacked. Whilst the bloodbath was beginning to die down and the surviving tributes fled, Lazarus briefly watched and was even seen in a replay to let out a slight laugh when Treasure shouted for his help. Yet as Lazarus looked back, he noticed the boy from 9 just a second before he was about to attack him with a knife, but Lazarus quickly grabbed an axe from the wall before swinging it around in his direction and letting out a frenzied giggle as he fell to the floor. The boy from 11 and Puff then got up and seemed to decide that it was best to not try fighting Lazarus. However, as they fled, Pearl was running back through the clearing, and she swiftly threw one of her knives at the boy from 11, who immediately fell to the ground. She aimed her other knife at Puff, but he narrowly avoided it and ran around the side of the cornucopia, becoming the last tribute to make it to the relative safety of the forest, where he joined his district partner Whipper in running away. Pearl tutted with disappointment when she missed Puff, before asking Lazarus who had killed Treasure, to which he honestly replied that it was Puff. She rolled her eyes and said that Treasure's family were going to be so embarrassed about that, but that they could take him out soon. As Pearl, Lazarus, and Selina proceeded to look at the bodies and carnage around them, they agreed to gather the remaining supplies into a pile in front of the cornucopia, which was done in a relatively quick and uneventful manner, although when the dying girl from 5 grabbed onto Selina's leg, she jumped and let out a scream, before quickly shooting her in the head. Pearl was also very surprised to find 2 pairs of night vision goggles close to the mouth of the cornucopia, which she excitedly put in her bag to save for later. The trio then checked the fallen tributes' bodies for any useful supplies that they may have had in their pockets, and after realizing that there was nothing of real use, they heard 11 cannons sounding, with Lazarus stating that they had done well. Over the next 2 hours, they appeared to be relatively relaxed, as they sat around the pile of supplies in the sunshine of the clearing. During this time, they looked out in different directions, each with their respective weapon at the ready. They also spoke about who the strongest remaining threats were, with Pearl believing these to be Skye from 14, Garrick from 7, and Watusi from 10. Upon hearing Garrick's name, Selina bit her lip, but she quickly recomposed herself, and stated that she hoped they found Watusi first out of these 3, to which Lazarus enthusiastically agreed, labelling her a meddlesome little weasel. Over the next hour, the trio discussed what hazards might occur later in the arena, although Pearl suggested that they were most likely to be safe in this clearing, especially when the feast occurred. Selina agreed, and said that they could also climb onto the cornucopia in order to avoid animals, but just as she finished this sentence, Pearl quietly asked her to pass the bow and arrow. Lazarus and Selina immediately asked why Pearl wanted the bow and arrow. She told them to not look, but that she had just seen something moving within the forest on the western side of the clearing, nearest to where she was sitting. Lazarus did not look, but he asked Pearl who it was, to which she impatiently replied that she did not know, but that she could hit this person from where they were. Selina appeared hesitant, but she slowly handed over her bow and arrow to Pearl, who pretended to be stretching the bow and examining the arrows. A tense moment passed as she grinned, before suddenly twisting around and aiming the arrow, which she let fly into the surrounding forest. During their earlier conversation, Eugenia and Ennius had followed Boston from Six, who had been travelling back to the western side of the clearing, although it was unknown as to why. He had spotted the career pack before hiding by a tree, where he was waiting for almost an hour, presumably for them to move away or for darkness. He had remained mainly still throughout this time, but he was carefully trying to move behind another tree that was further away, which allowed him to be seen by Pearl. The arrow hit Boston in the heart, and he fell forward to his knees. Pearl breathed out and smiled, stating that archery was not even her best skill. However, as Boston's cannon sounded, Eugenia noted that Lazarus was looking at her with a very troubled expression, saying that he did not like that comment, as the hovercraft flew in. Once Boston's body had been collected, Pearl spoke to Selina and asked about her mentoring situation. Selina briefly explained that Rubius was the mentor to both her and Lazarus. Although many accounts show that Selina had not been completely happy with this arrangement, she did not show this to Pearl, while saying that she had a good relationship with her stylist, Ariadne. Pearl then replied that she had a great relationship with her mentor, Mirai, and that she had improved her sparring skills over the past year after attending the Kobayashi Self-Defense Center. Yet as Selina looked like she was waiting to ask a question, a sword suddenly swung around into Pearl's neck, beheading her and knocking her head to the ground, as blood splattered over Selina and a cannon sounded. Selina gasped in shock, before letting out a high-pitched scream and jolting around to look up at Lazarus, who was smiling contently. In a futile frenzy, Selina attempted to brush the blood and unidentified body parts from her jacket and hair, while squealing in disgust, but she quickly picked up the bow and arrow again, which she aimed at Lazarus. He breathed out and quietly said, "Let's both just calm down." Selina looked at him in disbelief, but Lazarus dropped his sword, saying to her that it was just a bit of blood. She then slowly placed the bow on the ground, before clawing another unidentifiable substance from her hair. Selina asked in a panicked tone why Lazarus had just killed Pearl, to which he calmly replied that she was trying to upstage both him and Selina, adding that he did not like how she was trying to take charge of their group, and that they ultimately had no need for her. Selina appeared annoyed, but apparently realizing that Lazarus could also kill her, she grabbed a bottle of water from the pile of supplies and moved away from the deathclaw of the incoming hovercraft as she washed her hair and face with this water. Lazarus looked in satisfaction at Pearl's body and head being taken away, while Selina was continually spitting onto the ground, even though none of Pearl had entered her mouth. Over the rest of the afternoon, Selina gradually seemed to understand why Lazarus had killed Pearl so suddenly, but she insisted that he involve her in any future decisions like this, to which he agreed. However, Lazarus then asked why Selina reacted so strongly to Pearl's death, and she responded that although she had seen plenty of people being killed in past games, she had never seen this in the flesh, and that it was something different. Although Lazarus appeared slightly perplexed by this explanation, he did not pursue the topic any further. As it began to get dark, he suggested that they move their supplies into the cornucopia and set traps along its entrance, so that these supplies could be protected whilst they went hunting for other tributes that evening. Selina agreed, and she grabbed some very thin wire from the supply pile that Ennius announced to be called tripwire, with its purpose relatively self-explanatory. She asked Lazarus to chop down some branches from the forest, and over the next 20 minutes, they cut them into smaller pieces with sharper edges. On Selina's instructions, they stuck each of these pieces of sharp branch into various positions of the cornucopia's entrance until they were finally scattered. Selina then applied the tripwire across the lower parts of the cornucopia's mouth, so that they would likely cause any incoming tributes to fall onto these sharp upturned branches. Once it was dark, the pair had a brief supper, whilst deciding which way they should head later and what the arena might be like. After eating, arming themselves with weapons, and testing the night vision goggles for accuracy, they agreed to head west in order to start their night of hunting. Over the next 2 hours, the goggles greatly helped both Lazarus and Selina to navigate through the dense forests, streams, and occasional changes in the ground's height, although they were not able to find any other tributes. However, they did walk within 20 meters of Phoenix from Six, who had camouflaged herself within the bank of a stream, and later passed beneath Garrick from Seven, who had climbed high enough in a tree to avoid their detection. Yet once they were nearing the perimeter and Lazarus was clearly losing patience, Selina suddenly stopped him and pointed through a forest to their north, where Puff and Whipper, both from 8, were lapping up water from one of the streams. As Lazarus spotted them, he let out a smile that gradually widened when he realized what he was seeing. Selina and Lazarus quietly walked north with their bow and arrow and sword respectively. Puff and Whipper initially had no idea what danger was nearing them, but when Selina and Lazarus were less than 10 meters away, Whipper was heard to say to Puff that she thought she could hear something. Lazarus wasted no time and sprinted towards Puff, while Selina quickly headed towards Whipper. Puff ran through the darkness to his north, and despite clipping a few trees with his arm, he was able to run from Lazarus. Yet as Whipper had been running down the stream, Selina waited for a decent shot through the darkness, until she finally fired an arrow at her arm. The resulting scream then distracted Puff, who proceeded to run into a tree and fall to the ground. Lazarus swiftly found Puff and snapped his neck, which sounded his cannon. Meanwhile, Selina was carefully walking through the stream towards Whipper, who was desperately looking around in the darkness and crying for her mother. Although many viewers in Snow Square were shouting at Selina to kill Whipper, she simply stopped in her tracks and looked in curiosity as the tears continued. Whilst Whipper appeared to realize that her shooter was approaching, she pleaded that she was scared and did not want to die. Yet when Selina appeared to hear Lazarus jogging back towards her, she removed her goggles and Whipper continued to cry. As Lazarus came into view, Selina shot another arrow at her heart, and the sound of her pleading was instantly replaced with that of a cannon. Whilst the hovercraft came in to collect the bodies of Puff and Whipper, Lazarus asked why Selina had taken so long, to which she replied that she was trying to extract information from Whipper about other tributes, but that she knew Whipper was lying, so she killed her. Lazarus nodded in approval, and Selina suggested heading back to the cornucopia, as it was almost midnight and she was now tired, to which Lazarus agreed. He did not appear to have noticed that Selina had removed her goggles, but she quickly placed them back over her eyes as they began to walk east. They hardly spoke, and it was noticed on the night vision cameras that whilst Lazarus was avidly looking for other tributes, Selina seemed disengaged with her surroundings. Almost an hour later, the pair were a few hundred meters from the cornucopia, when Horn of Plenty played. The portraits of Treasure and Pearl, both from 1, the Boy from 4, both tributes from 5, Boston from 6, Esther from 7, Puff and Whipper, both from 8, both tributes from 9, the Boy from 10, both tributes from 11, and the Boy from 14 were all shown in the sky, which meant that only 11 tributes now remained. This record-breaking total of 15 fallen tributes on the first day clearly surprised many of the surviving tributes, with Eugenia joking that the victor would likely be out on the town by the next evening. A few minutes later, Lazarus and Selina arrived within the cornucopia clearing once again. Although Selina seemed tired, Lazarus joyfully ran ahead, before gasping with pleasure as he saw that a tribute had fallen into the trap at the entrance of the cornucopia. Shortly before the deaths of Puff and Whipper, Watusi from 10 had reached and run through the central clearing. As she neared the cornucopia, she appeared happy to gradually see the outline of these supplies through the dark, but this pleasure quickly changed to pain when she tripped on the wire and impaled both her leg and stomach on 2 different sharp branches. Although this did not kill her, she had lost a lot of blood and was now barely conscious. Selina watched in a daze as Lazarus carefully removed the wires and awakened Watusi. She began to cry in pain as he taunted her for trying to steal their supplies, but she appeared too weak to answer. Lazarus then grabbed Watusi and pulled her to her feet from the sharp branches below. However, Selina seemed to find this difficult to watch, and so she quietly removed her goggles. Lazarus began to ask Watusi where the others were, but she insisted that she had no idea. Lazarus did not believe this and tried to inflict more pain against Watusi's wound, which made her scream while Selina slowly walked away. This agonizing display continued for almost 5 minutes, during which time Selina suggested that they simply kill Watusi, as she had no information and it was now well past midnight. However, Lazarus did not listen and continued to push Watusi against the cornucopia wall, whilst punching her wounds as Selina waited behind him. Although she was no longer wearing her goggles, she still appeared fazed by Watusi's pleas for mercy. Yet after another minute, Watusi kicked Lazarus in the groin, which caused him to yelp and fall backwards. Selina then shot her arrow through the darkness, which hit Watusi's temple, and as she fell to the ground, a cannon sounded. Through his pain, Lazarus angrily asked Selina why she had done this, but she replied that Watusi could have got him just then, and that she would not be able to sleep through the groans of pain. Upon hearing the end of this sentence, Lazarus appeared to understand, and he reluctantly agreed that Selina may be correct. He agreed to take the first watch, and Selina thanked him as she headed into the cornucopia. Over the next hour, it was noted by Eugenia that Selina was having trouble sleeping, with Eugenia guessing that she may have a guilty conscience, to which Ennius jokingly asked what this was, before dismissing the idea, stating that Selina was from District 2, and hence born to fight in these games. However, she eventually fell asleep, and Lazarus used his goggles to keep watch through the darkness for the next 3 hours. After this time, Selina took over, and she kept watch until sunrise. As Lazarus awoke, Selina said that she wanted to wash herself in the forest, and he warned her not to travel too far, to which she agreed. Selina appeared to hurry as she reached the edge of the clearing, before catching her breath as she almost ran into a tree. She then breathed out in apparent bewilderment, and Eugenia stated that she would love to know what's going on in her head. However, Selina suddenly slapped her own face, nodded, and poured some more water over her head. She appeared to come to her senses, then filled the bottle again and returned to the clearing. For the rest of the morning, most tributes travelled throughout the arena, although Phoenix from 6 remained in the same position that she had been for the last 18 hours, and Jackson and Cleanser, both from 12, and Sky from 14, rested near the southern perimeter and took turns keeping watch. Lazarus initially practiced throwing spears at targets within the cornucopia, with the sound appearing to annoy Selina, although she did not say anything. Towards the end of the morning, they also formulated upcoming strategies, with Lazarus suggesting that Garrick from 7 and the Outliers were the only possible threats remaining. Selina agreed, suggesting that they remain in the cornucopia and wait for others to come to them. Yet shortly after midday, Lazarus noticed the sky was suddenly becoming dark, and within only a minute, the entire arena was almost completely void of any light. Selina was clearly perplexed by this sudden darkness, whilst Lazarus licked his lips and grabbed his goggles, before stating that this was perfect. Meanwhile, Eugenia squealed that she loved a good blackout, and as other tributes were seen to be panicking at their sudden lack of vision, Ennius responded that they would have no idea what was about to hit them. Selina quickly put on her goggles and loaded her bag with arrows, as Lazarus practiced a little more with his sword. They then attached the tripwire to the cornucopia's mouth, even though Ennius stated that they would not need it, but Selina still insisted. After a final check, they agreed to head south this time. Over the next hour, neither Selina nor Lazarus found any other tributes, most of whom tried to hide or climb trees. The pair unknowingly had a close encounter with Marinella from 4, who did not seem to realize that she was in fact following them, although fortunately for her, she changed direction before they would have spotted her. As the ground began to rise towards the perimeter, Selina asked to have a break by the side of a wide stream. Lazarus was initially against this idea, claiming that they needed to use the darkness whilst they could, but Selina responded that another tribute could travel towards them, so this was just as good as searching. Lazarus reluctantly agreed, and Selina poured some water into her now empty bottle, but as she looked up, she appeared to notice something through her goggles on the other side of the stream.